So I'd like to welcome everyone to the webinar series, Dispute Management in a New World, Financing Development in Emerging Economies, Policy, Investments and Disputes Resolution. Now this is an extremely timely topic. The sort of world order and the trade hegemony and many other policy areas are shifting very quickly in this new COVID world. Debt is changing, as everyone is aware, and growth patterns have been completely interrupted over the past year and a half. And so, you know, the importance of being able to grow out of the situation that we find ourselves in and the importance of debt and financing that is incredibly important. So without further ado, I'd like to just welcome the list of sponsors. The organizer of this webinar is the Jamaica International Arbitration Centre, and the sponsors are the Caribbean Development Bank, ADB Consultants, Jamaica Standard Products, CP Malcolm Dispute Management Practitioner, Island Blue Jamaica Mountain Coffee, Jamaica Deposit Insurance Corporation, COK Saudi Cooperative Credit Union, Roots Warrior, and the media partners are Hype TV, and we would like to welcome all local, regional, and international supporting institutions. So I would like to welcome everyone to the seminar, and I would like to acknowledge our guests today, Ambassador Mr. Anthony Hilton, CD MP Western St. Andrew, partner at Samuda Johnson Law Firm, and leader of the opposition PNP. Dr. William Warren Smith, President, Caribbean Development Bank, Barbados. Mrs. Marlene Street Forrest, CDJP Managing Director of the Jamaica Stock Exchange. Ms. Valerie Vieira, CEO, Jamaica Business Development Corporation, or how we know here, JBDC. Dr. Christopher Malcolm, Secretary General of the Jamaica International Arbitration Centre. Mr. John Rooney, Jr. Esquire, PA and Advisory Board Member to the Jamaica International Arbitration Centre. Mr. Lloyd Distant, Jr., President of the Jamaica Chamber of Commerce, and other panelists on our global audience, and obviously all of our sponsors and supporting institutions. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Mr. John Rooney for him to give his welcome.
Melanie, thank you very much. I hope that everyone is able to hear me. I know in this time of pandemic, one of the things that we've all become is kind of at least informal experts on Zoom. So I'm hoping this is working okay. As Melanie indicated, I am an advisory board member to the center, and I have been privileged to witness the birth and development of the center over these years. And just wanted to make a couple of comments that highlight, I think, the importance of today's event. One of the things, if you look at the promotional material, is that there is a reference to the concept of thought leadership. It's one thing to be a center for the resolution of disputes, and obviously that is a good thing. It is a good part of the what I will call the developmental infrastructure of the region. But it is another thing to bring speakers of the quality that we have here today together to speak to subjects of such importance to the region. No doubt in the past, no doubt in the future, as has been in the case in the past, the region will be requiring funds for the financing of development projects. Those funds will come obviously from international public sources, from institutions also such as I think the developmental arms of the World Bank and of the IBD, for example, as well as from private sources. The manner in which those dispute resolution procedures are established and agreed obviously can have significant impact as well. For that reason, I think that today's program is particularly important. It brings together people from a number of different areas, not only specialists in dispute resolution, but also people who are intimately involved in developmental projects in the region and the promotion of its future development. So without more, and taking no time from more time from what I would consider to be the really important speakers, I will conclude my remarks once again, just thanking the center personally for allowing me to be involved, and once again recognizing what I think to be the really new and outstanding role of the center in the region, not with respect just to infrastructure for dispute resolution, but also thought leadership. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. We really appreciate that. So moving on to greetings. So I would like to welcome Dr. Warren Smith to give greetings from the Caribbean Development Bank. Thank you.
Okay, first of all, I'm pleased to be part of today's timely discussion on financing investments in emerging economies, policy investment, and dispute resolution. Your ongoing effort to include the Caribbean Development Bank in these discussions does resonate with us. So why is today's discussion so important? COVID-19 has undermined our already fragile regional economies. The impact has been severe, with gross domestic product declining by over 7% in 2020. There have been significant job losses, and fiscal and debt sustainability concerns exacerbated as governments seek to contain this virus's spread and to provide economic stimulus and protect vulnerable groups. Many of you may concur with my view that there is still a lot of uncertainty about when we can abate this crisis and accurately determine the scale of its impact on our economies. Like me, you're also probably thinking, boy, bad luck worse than Obia. But after much reflection, I have arrived at the position associated with Karen Sullivan, who said, in the face of adversity, we have a choice. We can be bitter or we can be better. In short, we will need to mount an extraordinary response to facilitate the rebuilding and recovery of our economies. With this approach, our region can get back on track to meet its commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals. Now more than ever, the synergistic roles of the public and private sectors and development agencies like CDB come into stark focus. They'll be required to provide the necessary financing and human resources and to adopt complementary policies and institutional support. In the time allotted to me, Chair, I would love to touch briefly on two general areas. First, what are the possible derailers for the private sector to become the engine of sustainable growth and development in the Caribbean? At the top of the list would be an uncertain business environment marked by, among other things, growing protectionism, worsening trade disputes, institutional weaknesses, and lack of transparency. Improvements in public financial management are also critical considerations in investment decisions. Widening fiscal deficits point to inefficiencies and policy ineffectiveness, and an increasing reliance on debt creates financial vulnerabilities. Governments that prioritize fiscal and debt sustainability contribute significantly to creating a business-friendly environment. It is noteworthy that the government of Jamaica's steadfast efforts to accumulate sizable fiscal surpluses provided a much-needed cushion to meet the unanticipated expenditures associated with COVID-19. We applaud the government's ongoing commitment to build such buffers as part of a broader effort to facilitate private sector development. I turn quickly now to the role of the CDB. In keeping with our poverty reduction mandate, we are very mindful of our role in galvanizing a competitive, business-friendly environment. Our primary focus is on micro, small, and medium enterprises across all economic sectors, including agriculture, which embrace the power of digital technologies. Recent initiatives which we have taken include improving MSMEs' access to credit through financial intermediaries, capacity building through our Caribbean Technological Consultancy Services Network, and trade facilitation under the new Economic Partnership Agreement Standby Facility, which was launched in 2020, and centralizing all aspects of our private sector interface in a restructured private sector division. We're also revamping our procurement policy and procedures to become more fit for purpose and aligned with multilateral development bank best practices. We are promoting more rigorous and transparent public procurement legislation, regulation, and practices at the national level, and amending our standard loan conditions, including in the area of arbitration, to ensure that we remain in step with international best practice in the financial sector. But what has COVID-19 taught us? The 18 months have taught us that Jamaica's reliance on tourism and bauxite alumina for over 50% of foreign exchange earnings and more than a quarter of the jobs needs to be addressed. Concentration is a serious risk for most businesses and for most countries. The trick now is to move towards a more diversified economy and with special focus on MSMEs in manufacturing and services, which can compete domestically, regionally, and worldwide. The ability to be globally competitive will be dependent upon the adoption of digital technologies underpinned by a business-friendly environment and the availability of a suitably skilled workforce, even if those skills must be imported. Madam Chair, I thank you.
Thank you for that. There's a lot of information in there, and discussing the derailers for growth. At any point in time, I think you can start to see a pickup in growth, and then something coming along and seeing what else might derail the trajectory that we hope that we can find ourselves on. The importance of public sector management, better procurement, fiscal and debt stability. And I think, this discussion on MSMEs and digital technology is extremely important. And I think one of the things that we've learned in the past year is that policy can be agile in a way that we've never seen policy be agile before. And, if we can react in the same way, and, seeing 55,000 people turn up at the national arena and get a COVID vaccination in 5 days, you can see that where there is a will, there is a way. And I think that if those things can be applied to the areas that you're discussing and the policy areas you're talking about, I can see that would be extremely beneficial for not only Jamaica, but for the region. So, moving on, I will just welcome Mr. Christopher Malcolm, who is moderating this discussion.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam Chair, and our apologies collectively for a timing issue, it appears. But we do have Ms. Vera on, Val Rivera, who can in fact provide her greetings prior to my in fact taking on. So Ms. Vera, you're with us.
Well, I'm very excited that I heard MSMEs from Dr. Warren Smith, because that is my DNA. So I'm excited that there is this great focus in recent times on supporting and building the capacity of the MSMEs. Well, my job was really to move the vote of thanks. And probably I can even bring that forward, Christopher, to say that I want to congratulate you and your team, first of all, because I must tell you, you have a fantastic team. And I want to say they've really crossed every dot and crossed every T and really put a dot over every I. And we are very grateful for their support. My greetings from JBDC. We have been working for some time with your organization, JAIAC, and we know that you are invested in really moving many important issues forward. I think this evening is going to be one such one, and I'm waiting anxiously for the discussion, the reasoning session, and I must tell you, for the Warrior King at the end. So plenty greetings from JBDC, and I'm sitting in and I'm making lots of notes, and as Dr. Smith says, we on to better instead of bitter. So JBDC is very happy to be part of this process this afternoon.
Thanks, Ms. Vera, for having given an impromptu greetings at the beginning prior to your vote of thanks at the end. I am Christopher Malcolm, and for short, my involvement here is I'm a sometimes lawyer, but more importantly, a person who uses law as a crutch for my greater interest in sustainable economic development. And all of this really is about what we're about and how it is as small emerging economies, we are able to find our way through what is a difficult terrain, tiptoeing through the raindrops more often than not, to try to make ourselves viable and to try to work forward. Now, before I proceed further, now I'm seeing Mrs. Marlene Street Forrest from the Stock Exchange, and I must indicate specifically because she too would have been under the, she's never late for anything. For those persons
not at all.
in her late, I can say without a shadow, she is never late. So it is as a result of this technical glitch why she's actually on. So before proceeding, I'll also ask her if she could at this point give us the greeting that she had planned for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Malcolm. I see that we did have a problem. And just to say all protocols observed having been established. And to say thank you for your kind invitation to be a part of Coffee Time at JAIAC, sharing in the discussion on financing investment in emerging market, policies, investment, and dispute resolution. And really talking about the emerging economies, which are typically referred to as economies that experience considerable economic growth and possess some but not all the characteristics of a developed economy. While the matter of growth has eluded Jamaica for some time, key features such as stable democracy, high return on investment, strong regulatory framework, and certainty of financial transactions, including the ability to repatriate profit, have been at the forefront of our attractiveness to investors that seek to do transactions within our capital markets. This has made us indirectly seen by many wishing to make foreign direct investments into Jamaica as an emerging economy. I say all of that because specifically as it relates to the securities market, which is regulated by the Securities Act, and is a market in which Jamaica Stock Exchange operates. We recognize that to attract whether local or international capital to finance investments, a strong regulatory framework, including measures to address and resolve dispute, is critical to our success and has been critical to the successes we have achieved in the past. It is therefore not surprising that despite the pandemic, where the markets are down, investors continue to put their monies into IPOs, additional public offerings, and other forms of capital. Market confidence is still strong, and there are regulations in place post-investment to ensure that investors are protected. And a little about this Jamaica Stock Exchange. We are categorized, as using the strong regulatory organizational model, and that's the SRO. And we regulate the broker members and listed companies through our rules that promote an orderly market and result in market confidence among businesses, organizations, and investments. It is precisely for the reason where we understand that rules and regulations are necessary that in 2008, we decided to demutualize to address the question, perceived or not, of conflict of interest and matters relating to natural justice. Considerable amount of time was spent in reformulating our regulatory and market oversight framework, resulting in the separation of our regulatory arm from our commercial arm, and instituting an independent cast of directors to comprise a regulatory and market oversight committee of the board, whose decision on regulatory matters are final. The change in structure also included the amendment to our rules relating to disciplinary procedure. And this procedure captures how matters relating to disputes are handled in respect to broker member to broker member or between a broker member and his client, including how disputes are resolved, the process of appeal, penalties, fines, and compensation. As markets evolve and the financial transaction and investment becomes more complex and sophisticated, and there are larger cross-border flows of investments in Jamaica, the Jamaica Stock Exchange has focused its attention on strengthening its policies to include framework relating to areas such as data protection, cybersecurity, and an enhancement of how we look at contracts. And that is in order to minimize the need for dispute resolution and to enhance the procedure relating to same. As these issues are dynamic, during the course, I understand of this timely webinar, I know I'm a little late for it, I expect we will learn, and I specifically will learn more about what is happening within the Caribbean and globally, so that as an exchange, we can continue to inspire the trust needed to attract global capital for growth and development of businesses, and by extension, Jamaica and the Caribbean. I look forward to learning more about the areas of dispute resolution through this webinar and going forward. I thank you again, Dr. Malcolm, and the other members for inviting the Jamaica Stock Exchange.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Marlene Street Forrest. I'd like to welcome Mr. Lloyd Distant, President of the Jamaica Chamber of Commerce, to bring his greetings.
Thank you so much, Melanie. Christopher Malcolm, the chair of the JAIAC, to distinguished guest speakers and panelists, ladies and gentlemen, all good afternoon. I apologize for not being able to join you at the start of this, I'm going to use the term auspicious event. I think, I shouldn't say think, certainly for the chamber, the topic remains and continues to be quite timely. The investments and financial implications for investments in emerging markets, and of course, Jamaica being one of those, has been at the heart of a number of the discussions of the Jamaica Chamber of Commerce over the past many years. Most recently, as the Minister of Finance rolled out our 2021-22 budget, it came up for ongoing discussions, primarily because there's such a large focus on investments generally, infrastructure investments in particular, but investments generally into our market. And as these investments come in, the protection of capital and the opportunities that exist for local capital continue to come to the fore. I look forward to hearing the points that are going to be raised and participating in the discussion thereafter. The Jamaica Chamber of Commerce, always pleased to work alongside our partner JAIAC, and certainly want to welcome everyone, and certainly not just about bringing greetings from the chamber, but certainly expect that everyone will get out of this additional edification and additional knowledge to determine and guide policy for Jamaica. So there's some very quick comments, certainly bringing greetings to everyone for joining us here. And I'm looking forward to the ongoing discussions over the course of the rest of the evening.
Thank you very much, President Lloyd Distant. Thank you. So I would like to welcome back Dr. Malcolm, so we can start the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And they say we have to learn to whistle and ride, and I think you've been doing it exceptionally well. But let us move on. Now we're on to, as I was indicating, the reasoning element. And this particular area, as I was alluding to a little earlier, is of particular interest to me, and particularly at this time. Economies across the globe, wherever we find them, whether they're in the developed countries or emerging ones or underdeveloped, whatever we label them, have all suffered significantly over the last year, and others have been suffering for even longer periods with their economic development objectives. And even where we are seeing now that there are assessments coming out suggesting that the growth, we may get back to growth faster than we anticipated. Those of us in emerging economies know that there's going to be a long pain period. And there are certain industries that will have to reevaluate in all sorts of significant ways. Now, what is particularly painful for us in emerging economies is that for the most part, we have always grown when we do by reference, by reliance on the savings of persons from developed or other economies where we get our sources of finance. So there has always been this relationship where our development is significantly reliant on exogenous factors, many of which we have little control over. Now, in this environment, it is interesting now to see how do we manage? How do we change the game if we can? What are some of the lessons that we may learn, and how can we navigate our way forward, possibly even seeing this as a new starting point that can help us to go forward? And what is going to be critical here is that we take the right approaches to negotiation when we do, that we take the right approaches to renegotiation when we must, and that at the linchpin, and I'm seeing Ms. Reed, Natalie Reid on, and she is perhaps the most important person as far as I'm concerned in a sense at this moment, because she's so integrally involved in dealing with dispute management, both at the investor state level and at the commercial level in arbitration and otherwise. Because at the end of the day, the question is, how do you ring fence things by appropriate dispute management frameworks? And how do we ensure that those frameworks serve us well and that we are properly capacitated to be able to get them functioning? So at this point, without more, I will say we have 3 presenters in this reasoning session who are preeminently qualified. And I will not go into a lot of detail about them, except to say that if you go to the Coffee Time at JAIAC website.com, coffeetimejaiac.com, you will see all the details there. We have, of course, Ambassador Tony Hilton, who is with us, who is a policymaker here in Jamaica. He's a practicing attorney at law as well, and has significant experience in the area of trade and investment, and certainly in crafting of policy and implementation in a developing economy being Jamaica, with implications beyond. We have with us as well David Varela, who is himself an attorney, an academic, and a consultant with the World Bank, who has done work in the Caribbean region, including Jamaica, but whose field of operation primarily now is in Latin America. And he is, of course, based in Colombia. And then we have Natalie Reed, who is our 3rd presenter, who is everything we can think of in the sense that she practices from a developed country. She has strong roots in and is as umbilically tied as any I could know to emerging economies, being herself a Jamaican and everything else. And she comes as well with significant experience. And there's a lot that can be learned from about all of these persons by going to the website and seeing what is there. I won't spend much more time except to say I am very privileged to have these persons available for this reasoning. And we will take them as they're here. And we will also hopefully learn a lot from them throughout this experience. And without more, I'm going to ask David, who's with us, to tell us some of his experience. And David has a particular problem because he has to run as well. He teaches and does so many other things that we need to take him a little early as well so that he can say what he must. But David, your own introductory remarks on what it is, setting the stage as you see it for the reasoning that we have set out for this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Malcolm, and all the members of and organizers of this event. It's for me a great honor. I am currently in Panama, an offshore financial center, probably the most important in Latin America, together with Uruguay, Montevideo, and Punta del Este. And I'm dual citizen of Colombia and Panama and do business in both countries. And I am amazed at this point by the chances we all have of an immediate rebound for our economists, in particular in Latin America, but also in the whole world. If we look at the World Bank global economic prospects, with some caveats, because some risks remain, like these new outbreaks of the COVID virus or new mutations and variants. I think overall, we expect a substantial rebound of the world economy. So investment resources that have been looking for business opportunities will have to be deployed in various parts of the world. And the challenge for developing economies is to attract those resources to the priority areas. I think the comparison some economists are making today is with a war economy and a post-war reconstruction. This year of COVID-19 pandemic has been really a war against a hidden enemy. And that has meant a complete disruption of the global economy. What we believe were the fundamentals of our stability in developing countries were shaken. Everything we took for granted, like social protection nets for vulnerable people, disappeared overnight. And we had to devise new solutions for new problems that we hadn't anticipated just 14 or 15 months ago. So the challenge of this war meant governments and companies had to be creative, and creative to survive, to be able to cope with an enemy that was invisible and intractable. And now it seems to be, or seems to be entering into control in a way that we have vaccines and we have global programs to ensure widespread vaccination also in developing countries. But all this that has happened during the last year has also shaken very substantial assumptions. What about government intervention in the economy as a principle? Most of us have been educated in a tradition of free market economies, but in the middle of a war like the one we have been living during the last year, massive cries from the population and the electorates of all over the world are for government intervention. They are asking for more government, not for less. And that is something we have to realize puts enormous pressure on the political system. Politicians are now obliged to deliver. The people are asking for solutions to the COVID crisis and to the myriad economic problems that the crisis has generated. So at this point, I believe we are all in flux, seeing how we are able to move forward from the war economy we live at into the post-war reconstruction. So we will have to be creative as well in the financing mechanisms. I see, for instance, in the World Bank, where I work closely with colleagues in Washington, that really there are lots of expectations about new products because the traditional investment and technical assistance products of the multilaterals may have been designed for other age, for not war or post-war age, for business as usual time that unfortunately is now over. We will have to be preparing probably new instruments for providing the financial and technical assistance that developing economies need. And I am sure the World Bank will partner with the other multilateral banks, such as the Caribbean Development Bank or the Andean Finance Corporation, CAF, in our region, in the Americas, and the IDB to be sure that all the resources available for these institutions are mobilized to assist the client countries. So I would not expect to have shortage of funding. I would say there may be abundance of funding. What may not be found so easily is the right project or the right proposal for those resources to be allocated. I think I should stop here just to listen to my other colleagues in the panel, and thank you very much, Malcolm.
Mr. Malcolm. Before we proceed though, David, and I want, you raised a few things for me about the monies possibly being available, but wanting the right project and the right arrangements for them to happen. Now, with your experience, including in Latin America and in our region as well, what are some of the possible mixes, you know, the financing mix that you think we should be considering? And what are some of the new arrangements that could possibly help us out going forward? Understanding, of course, as you said, that some of the traditional approaches that we relied on were never really devised for a time like this. What do you think we should be looking seriously at and sort of getting our minds together around?
My own perception is that, for instance, the resources of multilateral banks should be used to attract resources from commercial banks. We would not expect at this point very large capital increases in the multilateral banks. There will be political maneuvering in the US Congress and other national parliaments, and going beyond what has been planned for the last few years about these capital increases may be problematic. But the ability of the multilateral banks to mobilize resources from the private sector, it is an area with significant room for growth, in my view. In the past, some timid approaches like guarantees provided by the multilaterals were explored, but in the end, those arrangements seem complex, convoluted, and the bread and butter remained the traditional investment project finance 100% by one multilateral or co-financed by various multilaterals. So the mix of multilateral financing and commercial financing was relatively rare. I would expect new instruments to come from a new mix and more creativity in the ability of managing both the sovereign and the commercial risk. And I think the multilaterals remain positioned in a way that provides the commercial banks or private investors in cases of new ventures, the chances of having more ability to conduct a balanced dialogue with the government of developing economy and find the suitable arrangements for project finance. For instance, I see a substantial revival of project finance, possibly with the guarantees or co-financing provided by multilaterals. And perhaps, for instance, the role of the private arms of the multilateral banks, such as IFC in the case of the World Bank Group, would also be enhanced. But I think we will have to be creative and break with traditional models. The old financing instruments will have to be revisited because the times we are living at require prompt decision-making and also the ability to mobilize large resources in shorter periods of time. It's life and health that is at stake at this point, and I think citizens all over the world will be putting a lot of pressure on governments to deliver, and private companies will also have to be aware of their corporate social responsibility, how we would respond to the challenges posed by the post-COVID era, how we prevent, for instance, a new pandemic from coming. That would be a new health infrastructure approach, because it's clear that health infrastructure failed almost all over the world. We didn't expect nothing like this to happen. So in addition to highways, dams, ports, the traditional large infrastructure projects, we may have to look into new investments into virtual surgery, genetic therapy, all the alternatives that are now for the protection of life and health available. Intensive in technology, I see all new ventures having some digital component. It's out of the question not to consider artificial intelligence or machine learning as part of even large infrastructure projects. And perhaps we lawyers, we will have to think when we will find a smart contract for large infrastructure ventures.
And just one thing, there are two things, David, before you close out on this that sort of popped out at me. Emerging economies have consistently complained that the conditionalities of the IFIs, the international financial institutions, have put them in a gridlock from which they're effectively doing what Michael Manley called walking up the down escalator. It really is one of those difficult positions to get out of. The second thing, of course, that you mentioned, which struck me, was the fact that project finance may become sexy again. And the question in that is, do you perceive from the IFI's perspective that there will be any significant relaxing or reshaping of traditional conditionalities, one, and in relation to project financing, now that you're suggesting that there may be a greater move to the commercial side of the financing institutions, how it is that you see this now in terms of the debt equity and the mezzanine type financing arrangements? How do you see that looking in your crystal ball over the short to medium term?
It's sometimes hard to use crystal balls these days, but I would start saying that we have to break with the stigma associated to multilateral conditionality. That's some sort, in my view, of urban legend that was created a long time ago in the 80s. It was initially associated with the Latin American debt crisis, and the words structural adjustment sounded like some sort of demonic force that was going to destroy the living conditions of millions of people in the world. I think that the stigma has to be removed for the trust and confidence in the work of the multilaterals to be restored. And if I can share some personal insights after more than 25 years working with the World Bank, I think that's completely unfair. Really, that stigma of heartless bureaucrats in Washington taking decisions that would take away the bread from the mouths of the children, that's some sort of cartoonish view about the work of the multilaterals. Really, it is serious business. It is hard business sometimes. And most of all, in my experience, the conditionality is not requested by the multilaterals. It's the ministers of finance ask the multilaterals to request them the conditionality, because it's the only way they can pass that through parliament or to make it more palatable to some groups of the population. It may look as an excuse or a pretext, but in the continuous bargaining process between governments and multilaterals, conditionality has been really stigmatized in an unfair way. It's more the outcome of some consensus about how to solve some issues in a particular economy, and it's not an unilateral imposition of the multilaterals in my own experience. I think we will have to work on that. It's a matter of both communications, public relations, and perhaps more transparency for everyone to understand what it means to restore a balanced budget for an economy and at the same time recoup some AAA rating in international capital markets. To explain that to the population is not easy, but there should be ways to get the message across. Otherwise, the stigma would remain and all the best efforts may be tainted by that ghost of conditionality that was really invented, in my view, by the critics of the multilaterals. And about project financing, I really anticipate new combinations of equity and debt, and in very different ratios, I believe, per sector, per country. We will have to recognize those differences. Not all sectors are equal, not all countries are equal. There is some economic rationality, so everyone has to make money. The private investor or the private bank have a business to do, and they are entitled to a reasonable profit. But at the same time, the projects have to be doable, successful, sustainable. I think, Mr. Malcolm, you have underlined that since the beginning. Sustainability is the essence. No infrastructure or even digital investment, for instance, would be acceptable for any financier, multilateral or otherwise, unless it is sustainable, which means that has chances of economic and financial success and stability. And I think that has to be measured in advance, and we have to do the right forecasts to see. Otherwise, it's just a hype of words like machine learning, Internet of Things. But if we don't put numbers into that and determine which investment on that is really profitable in economic and social terms as well, because there is some sort of social benefit that we will have to measure, for instance, in this area of health. All investments of health will have a different way to calculate the profits because we will have to take into account, for instance, the number of hours we prevent people from getting sick. That's a good indicator because we have lost millions of hours because of COVID. Probably we should start calculating the amount of working time available when people remain healthy.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, David, and I'm sure we will have a few questions coming back for you at the end. We now want to hear from Ambassador Anthony Hilton. As I indicated earlier, he has significant experience both on the trade negotiation side as a practicing attorney, as a policymaker, being a parliamentarian and former minister as well. And he is in the belly of the beast, so to speak, of an emerging economy, what the pulls and pushes are, and how it is that you have to navigate your way to ensure that you're having the right policy mix in place to deal with what are real needs, which is sustainable economic development. Ambassador?
Thank you. Thank you for having me on your program. The infrastructure challenges faced by societies, economies like ours is real. And this is particularly true in the post-COVID environment. I think as we are seeing in the United States, one of the first issues perhaps you would have addressed is the whole matter of what constitutes infrastructure and infrastructure investment in this period. And it is not simply, for us, it's not simply like the Biden administration. We agree that it's not simply for physical infrastructure. It has to address some other very important aspects, not least of which is the issue of broadband and internet connectivity, because the digital economy is upon us, and I think the COVID experience would have reminded all of us as to the urgency of addressing that particular infrastructure issue. For Jamaica and countries similarly situated in the Caribbean region, and in the Latin America and Caribbean region. It is no question but that there has been a deficit of investment for a disinvestment, if you will, for several, I would say, a decade or more, or maybe even two. And our debt dynamic does not make the situation any easier. It really then requires us to make critical choices in every budget period as to, and this is particularly true in the COVID period because the health consideration and the social considerations are priority claims as well on the budget. But I think we recognize as well that if we're going to have economic growth and to address our debt dynamic, the debt to GDP ratio, then we have to address the growth element of that ratio. And we have to therefore make the investment choices or decide whether we invest in the social dimensions or the infrastructure dimension, however defined broadly, if you include the social, or the physical infrastructure, if you're talking about the need for ports, roads, and hospitals, and those critical infrastructure needs. So our choices, the choices that faces us as a country, the choices that faces the parliament and the government are very critical choices. But for Jamaica, we have to consider as well our link to the CARICOM region, and the growth dimension for Jamaica must include the CARICOM single market and economy, and those include the 15 countries of CARICOM to which we are partners in the single market arrangement, so that the investment, Jamaica's internal or domestic market, is linked to what happens in the broader CARICOM market as well. And the investment needs, therefore, has to be looked at not just in the narrower Jamaica sense, but what is happening in the rest of the CARICOM market. The matter of funding, we have to look across a range of funding sources. The multilateral funding agencies have been there, playing a critical part. The Inter-American Development Bank, I should mention, has been a critical player in the infrastructure market for some time. The World Bank has been less so. I think our experience has been the disinvestment is not only from the national budgets, but I think more generally the multilaterals or the IFIs have not been focused, I don't think, perhaps with the only exception of the Inter-American Development Bank. The multilateral sources of investment have not been particularly present, and part of it as well is the debt dynamic that we have made a concerted effort over the last 10 years or so, from 20 onwards, to focus on the debt management and to reduce the debt to GDP ratio. We've just come out of an IMF program in which we have dealt with our debt situation very, very serious, and have begun to make some strides, but for COVID. So with the COVID situation, our budget is constrained, and therefore the question of attracting private investment into the space becomes very critical. And the private investment in infrastructure, I believe, for that to happen, we have to create an environment that incentivizes the private sector to get involved in the creation of funds, infrastructure funds, for example, that can begin to address some of these issues. In that context, the arrangements or the environment in which you incentivize the private sector, one of the critical elements must of course be dispute resolution mechanisms, because the private sector would want to, as part of their risk assessment, would want to know that if there are issues arising, that the dispute resolution mechanisms are there, they can be efficiently done, and that the matters for disputes can be efficiently settled. So I think the need for more private investment in the infrastructure, in the public, what has been heretofore considered as public infrastructure, I think there's a need to attract more private monies into those spaces. In a post-COVID environment, I think it really requires a very delicate balancing act, requiring us to look and to make very critical decisions, both from the point of view of a stimulus package to incentivize and stimulus to the private sector and to the public investment sector. But infrastructure remains a critical need if we're going to sustain that investment and to grow the economy on a sustainable basis.
Ambassador, something just clicked to me and I needed to follow it through. If we're going to look to the private sector financial institutions, the Paris Club, wherever we go, what is the reason? What is the bankable project, or what are the bankable projects that you're looking at in our region, Jamaica, Guyana, wherever, that you think would be attractive to them, one? And secondly, what do you think those institutions, if they are investing, should be asking of us? And are we in a position to be able to deliver to enable us to get the sort of development that we're hoping for?
Well, immediately, as I mentioned, I think the issue of for Jamaica, fortunately for us, there's broad agreement that our logistics, a logistics hub for Jamaica is critical. And on this, there's broad agreement on both political parties. That initiative started when I was Minister of Industry and continues into this administration. One of the things that was done was a commission. We commissioned a study on the Global Logistic Initiative that was undertaken by the World Bank, financed by the World Bank. It was a good report. Although it was commissioned while I was minister, the result of that study came out after in the new administration. The new administration, fortunately, has embraced that initiative, and I think that initiative for Jamaica represents some strategic investment project. The report, it is called the Global Logistic Hub Initiative, Market Analysis and Master Plan, and it contemplates a $28 billion investment over multiple years, multi-year investments, and addresses issues around logistics to ensure that Jamaica can, in fact, play the role of a logistics hub in this part of the world. And in a post-COVID environment, I think that has taken on a greater impetus, because the supply chain and what has happened in the COVID environment, where persons who knew there was a supply chain, but though it was imperceptible, couldn't really see it and really never think about it on a day-to-day basis. When we remember at the beginning of the COVID, when one could not get toilet papers, and the panic that set into our society, then I think the question of supply chain is now front and center. And therefore, the logistic hub, which supports it, and which was the initiative that we, as government, across government now, across administration, and for Jamaica, is focused on. I think that that package of investment remains a priority for Jamaica. And I think it is something I would want to bring to the attention of this group, to the IFIs, and to private investment, because some of the projects in that are private projects. You will recall, Christopher, that the special economic zone that Jamaica promulgated, which really follows up on the free zones that were traditionally the free zones, is now, the legislation and the regulation is now in operation, and it is a very attractive, it incentivizes the private sector to invest in that space.
And just one further thing on that. I know in Jamaica, and surprising to many actually, to be fair, the business process outsourcing sector seems to be a star, and but the question though, but there are remaining questions, including the level at which it functions and so on. What are the real possibilities there, and what are the limitations for financing in that sector that could probably be looked at as we're seeking to move forward?
Well, you're quite right. The BPO has been a star for some time. It was while I was minister, that we opened the sector for private sector investment, and I remember the first investment came from Mr. Jarrett, Carr Jarrett, out of Montego Bay. And truth be told, the day when that investment was signed, it was in collaboration with the Development Bank of Jamaica. He cried. And when I asked him why he was crying, he said he was taking on a liability and into a sector that he wasn't quite familiar with. But he was, he had been convinced somehow to take the plunge. Well, subsequently, it wasn't more than a couple of months after that he came back seeking additional funds to continue, not just with that project, with some other projects. So since then, the private sector, I think, has been far more confident in. Now, in Jamaica, it has, so far, the investment has centered largely around the making available the space, the space for hosting the BPO offices, so that much of the local investment has gone into the physical assets, the buildings, to host these BPO networks. The BPO, if we have to be careful there, because while the focus is on employment, and that's an appropriate focus, we have to be reminded that we've had the experience of the 807 textile sector, when that sector at which we operated at, really at the tail end, the lower end of that sector. One of the things we have to be careful about, and I think the problem is recognized, and the focus is being given to it, is that the funds, we need to upskill our workers. We really now need to make sure that they can play at the KPO end of it, the knowledge process outsourcing end of it, legal process outsourcing, and many other aspects of the outsourcing sector. And the skill level has to be built there. I know we have, from the World Bank, a global services fund that is funding training in that area, and I think that's appropriate. My only criticism of it so far is that it has focused mainly, and I think at the moment, primarily on the BPO sector, but global services must include the logistics sector as well. So I think the risk is now appreciated. I think there's some attention being given to upskilling, and the investment opportunity remains in yes, the assets, the physical assets, but we also, but for one or two of our entrepreneurs, we have primarily been, a number of our investors of Jamaican investment has been at the infrastructure, physical infrastructure end of it. And I think an opportunity resides there, but I'd like to see us more, the entrepreneurship and investment going into the BPO processes themselves.
Okay, thanks, Ambassador. And you know, it gives us a nice foray, really, to hear from Natalie. And why it is important for this reason. And you know, it's interesting, and persons may not realize it. All three speakers are in fact lawyers, and I happen to be legally trained. I wouldn't call myself a lawyer, but that's how I call myself in this context. But what is important, and I think we have to take it back home in this way, that whatever we identify the problems to be, whatever we identify the solutions to be, and whatever we identify the progress points to be, it all comes back ultimately to a legal arrangement as to how these are put in place. And secondly, I like to tell people this, that as lawyers, we function in the business of dispute management, whatever else we call ourselves. We're either assisting persons to avoid disputes or helping them to resolve them when they arise. And the starting point, as Natalie will no doubt say, is to ensure that you have properly negotiated and well-documented arrangements at the outset. But ultimately, even when you do that, you have issues arising that must be resolved. How do you deal with those? And what are some of the little lessons learned over time, having regard to our special circumstances that we must take on board, training or whatever other capacity or other related matters? And we have no better person than Natalie, given her vast experience and her strong connection to emerging economies, who can talk to us to some of the lessons learned and some of the things that we need to bear in mind in that centering back to the law approach that I think we have to take this conversation. Natalie?
Thank you very much, Dr. Malcolm. It is, as always, a pleasure and an honor to be invited to participate. And you are absolutely right. You know, an attendee to this webinar might well wonder, you know, sort of what is the role of lawyers and of disputes lawyers in particular when you are having these critical discussions about capital, about policy, about structuring and encouraging investment. And the answer, I think, is threefold. One is what Ambassador Hilton highlighted, which is that investors considering allocating and committing their capital to Caribbean markets as to any markets or jurisdictions across the globe want to have a sense of confidence that there is rule of law, that there is a framework, an avenue, and a certain amount of predictability with regard to the efficient resolution of disputes. Because as you said, at least some disputes will inevitably arise, and you do not want them to become hurdles to accomplishments of the shared goals. But perhaps more fundamentally is the point that you highlighted, and that I know that the JAIAC takes very seriously, which is dispute management and dispute avoidance. So the contribution, I would humbly suggest, of disputes lawyers is that we have seen it all. We have seen where things have gone wrong and can help market players, including governments and private enterprise, because I represent both and have been involved in disputes with regarding to both and with negotiations regarding to both, can help all kinds of market players anticipate these issues. Because if you think about it, if you can imagine where a problem may arise or where a dispute may end up, there are lessons learned from that experience that you can and should pull through the beginning of that process. So practically speaking, what do I mean? As Chris mentioned, if you start, for example, from considering the kinds of documents, the underlying negotiations that may be taking place. Mr. Varela pointed out One thing that we may be seeing going forward is a change in kind of the sources of capital. The Caribbean region, or some jurisdictions in the Caribbean region, have long seen a very important, if not dominant, role of the government in terms of structuring, guiding investment finance. In the current environment, I think that what we will see is two things that Mr. Varela touched on. You will see both an increase in a demand for more government, particularly if you think of meeting infrastructure challenges, as Ambassador Hilton mentioned, but you will see a mix of capital. And what does that mean as a practical matter when it comes to some of the documents that I'm talking about? It means that you have to understand who's going to be at the table, and you have to have as clear-eyed a view as possible about where you stand in that array of interests at the table. So if I had to break it down to the three most important considerations that you would carry into any set of negotiations, and this is whether it is a negotiation about financing, a negotiation about sort of debt or equity, a negotiation about the terms under which you may have joint venture participation, for example. So those three things. Number one, identification of the risks. Do you know what you are agreeing to? Have you identified not just the best case scenario, but possible problems? Have you assessed the likelihood that they will occur and considered the possible losses or setbacks that may entail? That is, do you know what the risks are and have you fully kind of assessed them? Second, who bears the risk? If I had to identify the perhaps most underappreciated source of disputes and of adverse outcomes in the context of disputes, it would be a failure to appreciate a misalignment between the risk and the party on whom it is imposed. And I'm thinking here of both the immediate risk and risks that are further down in the chain of possible consequences. So one way to perhaps to rephrase that is the party that bears the risk one that is best placed to minimize or avoid it? This is where, again, the job of the lawyer is recognizing how precious resources are, especially in these times, and wanting to act in the service of their client, but also, again, the goal of the ultimate project, and saying, look, it's not just a question of trying to shift risk from yourself to the other party. Take a step back and look at the allocation of risks across the parties at the table and saying, if the goal is dispute avoidance or minimizing disputes so everybody can get to the ultimate business objectives or policy objectives, do you have that alignment? And if you don't, or perfect alignment can sometimes be difficult to achieve, then you come back to the perspective of yourself, your client, those interests, and you say, well, what are the protections that you have in place with regard to the risks that you may not be able to fully control? In some instances, that may be a question of inserting additional language in the documents, granting certain rights, recognizing certain protections that may already exist as a matter of background law, or invoking those. In others, it may be, again, sort of standard mechanisms, whether it be project-related insurance, whether it may be indemnification provisions, and the like. And then finally, and perhaps most fundamentally, are the terms that you are negotiating and documenting clear and enforceable? Will you, in fact, get the benefit of your bargain? Will the documents that you are working on, the negotiations that you are engaging in, ultimately facilitate the achievement of those business objectives? Or have you inadvertently created or increased the opportunities for problems that will grow into disputes that will distract the players from the performance under those documents and ultimately cost precious resources? So with those three things in mind, identify the risk, consider whether the proper party bears it and whether you have protections, and whether the terms are clear, enforceable, and understandable to a third party, which is really the tribunal or the court that's going to have to be looking at that document. Then you really should spend time, and again, serious, clear-eyed time, to saying, do I have the right team in place? And that's a question, frankly, that should occur to anyone who's walking to a negotiation table, whether you are a government or a private sector entity. Because again, the goal is you have a certain objective that you need to achieve. Do you have the right team to help you achieve it? Again, I come back to 3 points. You're looking for competence, experience, and hopefully deal-specific or context-specific knowledge. So that team have the full range of skills that are needed. Can they help you to identify and then navigate around the risks that we've been talking about? Thinking very, very concretely from the perspective of a transactional lawyer, for example, do they know what is standard? Do they know what the market generally requires or expects when it comes to the terms that are generally reflected in those documents? And therefore, can they help identify for you where either you are going to be asking or the other party is going to be asking for something that deviates from that? Because the greater the deviation, the one way to think about it, the greater the deviation, the more that becomes a potential point of leverage in negotiations. You have to understand what you're asking for and how much that is different from what somebody should honestly be expected and anticipated to accept. And then finally, and I know that this may be a point of some sensitivity in the relatively small communities of legal counsel in which we operate, not just in the Caribbean, but in other small jurisdictions. You really should not hire your best friend just because she or he is your best friend. I do not disagree at all that it is important that the counsel who is representing you understands your goals and interests, understands what you need to achieve in the broad sense, not just in that particular transaction, but that can't be the only reason that you pick your counsel, right? It would be, the question you should ask is, do they know, or if they don't already know, can they quickly learn what is most important to you in the context of that relationship, that transaction, the broader policy, et cetera? And again, another way to break it down is, do they know what the deal breakers are? And do they know you and your government, your institution, your company well enough that they will eventually develop the instinct of understanding where your deal breakers are so that they can, again, help to advise you in terms of where you may have flexibility and not. And again, I can't kind of emphasize enough that one of the reasons you do this is not just to try to get the best lawyer in the room. It is because in this context, the lawyer acts as dispute manager or dispute avoider. So this is coming back to one of the points that I know is near and dear to Dr. Malcolm's heart. Finally, and I will pause here. What happens if all of your efforts at drafting the perfect contract and picking the best possible team and avoiding dispute fail, and the dispute then comes up? What should your next steps be? I'm actually going to say that you shouldn't wait until the dispute has crystallized. If you see that you won't be able to avoid the dispute, seriously consider whether it is worth getting into the dispute. Is this a matter where you may be able to reach a mutually acceptable settlement? And again, this is something you will have heard, in TV and movies. Sometimes the best settlement is the one that leaves everybody unhappy, but it is acceptable and it allows you to move on with the relationship. If you can't avoid the dispute and you can't settle it, then, and again, settlement on concrete, viable economic terms, then yes, you should try as hard as possible to position yourself well for the dispute. By this point, you should already have counsel, really, and that counsel should help you think about what is the ultimate trier of fact, the court or the tribunal. What are they going to want to look for? What are they going to care about? What are they going to be concerned about? And you should start, preparing yourself for that, including building that record. Because there are times when you may find yourself with a dispute that has begun, but in many instances, the best way to end a dispute before you get to a judgment or an award is to prepare yourself to litigate, to arbitrate, to mediate from as strong a position as possible. So you need to prepare yourself for that. so that again, you can get to the best possible resolution of that dispute from your position. And again, as much as possible, try to preserve the resources that would otherwise be spent on that dispute for the accomplishment of your business or policy goals. So I'll pause there, Chris.
Thanks, Natalie. And it's always good to hear your aligned points, aligned to mine in many ways. I love to hear them. But you know, there's something that, and anybody who has heard me speaking on contract, teach on the area or any such thing, know that I have 3 letters that I go by. I am. And you've said it perfectly. It's about risk management, risk identification, risk allocation, and risk management or mitigation. And that is all this whole area substantially is about. But one of the things though, and we can't, as I said, we inevitably can't avoid that very often. So there are 2 questions I think that I'd like you to look at. Now that you are in the arena of a fight, assuming it's an arbitration, how do you work around it? And secondly, what are some of the alternatives that persons should reasonably consider at the negotiation stage that could help them make the fight fairer or easier to navigate in? Because I think those are 2 of the things that I'm particularly interested in. And I think the audience would be as well.
Excellent questions, Chris, and I'll take them in reverse order. Because as with so much else, things start with what you either accomplish or fail to accomplish at the negotiation table. One of the things that you should do, and this is kind of underscoring a point that both of us have made, is when you're at the negotiation table and you're kind of crafting that contract, trading deal points, including what the arbitration agreement looks like, you really should think about what will the arbitration look like if I find myself in a dispute? And it boils down again to a few critical questions. Is it more likely that I will be the claimant or the respondent, the party bringing the claim or the party defending it? Because that will help inform how much I care about particular features of the arbitration process. I should pause here and emphasize that speaking as an international arbitration practitioner and as somebody who sits as an arbitrator in commercial disputes, one of the things that parties sometimes fail to appreciate is how much power and autonomy they have at the negotiation stage, at the contract drafting stage, in determining what an arbitration looks like. That is by far the critical distinguishing feature between court litigation, where sometimes literally you roll up to court and what you get is what you get. Whatever judge happens to be on the bench that day, whatever the rules will or won't allow you to do, whereas you have a lot more flexibility in arbitration. So which side am I going to be on? Is there a threshold above which I care more about certain kinds of disputes and care less about other kinds of disputes? Is this an ongoing commercial relationship where it's actually going to be really important to identify certain smaller kind of disputes and say that those will be resolved by other means, by negotiation, by discussion between the principals, by referral to an expert or mediation, and then really leaving arbitration, which can be a lengthy and expensive process, for the very important, kind of threatening the deal kind of disputes. So think about it from that perspective and make maximum use of the power and autonomy that you have as a party. When you find yourself in the unfortunate position of being in an arbitration, or you are in a position where you say you have no choice but to file the claim, or you have received that request for arbitration and you are now a respondent whether you want to be or not, the choice of counsel is really important. If I meant it before when I said, don't pick your best friend, I cannot say it more strongly now. And I say this not as a way to kind of generate business. From the perspective of somebody who sits as an arbitrator, it is important to have counsel who understand the distinction between litigation and arbitration, who understand the levers and the role that counsel can play, and who understand, frankly, something about the law of arbitration, so that, again, they don't inadvertently steer you into mistakes. But if I had to think about the most critical strategic decisions, it would be the choice of rules, so you know which institution is going to be administering your arbitration. It would be the choice of arbitrators so that you fully deploy, again, that power that you have, which you cannot have generally in the court system, to pick the persons who are going to decide your case. That is probably the most important strategic decision that you can make at the outset of a dispute. And then finally, do not ignore the off-ramps. And I said this before, one of the best things that you can do is put yourself in a position to resolve a dispute before you get to the award or the court judgment. What can sometimes happen when you find yourself in a dispute is that the parties develop blinkers. It's all about winning, and winning is defined by defeating the other party in the case, getting an award, getting a judgment. There are times when you should really look for the opportunities where you have developed and can deploy leverage. You win a very favorable decision in an early stage of the case. That might be a good point to reach out to the other side and suggest, you know what, now you're getting an early indication of where this might head. Why don't we see if we can amicably settle this? So again, the spirit and the focus on the bottom line that animates dispute avoidance generally is not something that you just jettison once you find yourself in an active dispute. It should continue to inform your strategic and tactical moves.
Okay, thanks. And we will have time for some questions that we will pose, and there are a couple that I've already seen. But prior to doing that, and we did have a rushed process at the beginning, but nevertheless, we do have our sponsors who are kind to us and who we rely on. One of them now is Jamaica Deposit Insurance Corporation. We will, before we proceed into the question and answer session, just do a short video that they have produced as part, and we typically take one or so others of these on these occasions. We have one now from the JDIC, and for those persons wishing to ask questions, please put them in the question and answer, and I will take them from there. I have also seen one in the chat, which I will take, but please put them in the question and answer session. Now is a good time to do that. Can we now have the JDIC ad, please?
I save because one day my little business is going to be a big deal.
Yeah, and I make sure to put away a little something for him.
And thanks to JDIC, deposit insurance protection on my savings gone up.
You've been upgraded. Deposits held in commercial banks, building societies, and merchant banks are covered under the JDIC deposit insurance scheme up to $1.2 million per depositor per institution. JDIC.
Protecting deposits for you and me.
Now, what I'm going to do at this stage is take a couple of the questions that I've seen, and I'll start with one, and this looks like something that is geared to the ambassador. And I don't know why they're picking on you, ambassador, but I know your back is broad. The question is, and I'm just reading it as it's stated, has the politicization of the global supply chain changed any perspective on Jamaica's logistic hub? Is there politicization, I suppose, the first question, and the question is, has the perspective changed at all as you see it?
Well, let me just say, interestingly, the geopolitics of supply chain has really, to my mind, worked to Jamaica's advantage, in that one of the things that is very clear is that the supply chain, persons are talking about reshoring the supply chain, which in this context means manufacturing entities that have left the United States many years to go elsewhere, mainly in China and the Far East, are now much more sensitized about the complexities of the supply chain, and the longer the length of the supply chain, the more sensitive, the more complex it is. And so the move now is to really try to simplify the supply chain, make it much more, much simpler, much more resilient. And in many instances, that means bringing it, regionalizing that effort. And I think in that sense, the estimate as I see it is that some $1.5 trillion of investment will be moving from different places as a result of the risk to supply chains. And I think Jamaica stand to benefit if we act in ways that can really increase our chances of playing host to a number of those entities that will be moving closer to home, so to speak.
And Ambassador, and I'll just for clarity, and I think sometimes we presume many things, but for the uninitiated, what is a simple definition of what is a supply chain, and the global supply chain in particular?
Well, a supply chain is really that that mix of things that gets the goods from the place of origin to the place of destination, or to more particular to the customers, and the different routings to get there. The optimal route, the best routes to get there, some are things that have to be given great thought to. You have to look at cost of getting them there in the conditions, the best condition that you'd want, and getting there in a timely basis. So it's involved both the logistics of it and some of the decisions that have to be taken, usually driven by data and a lot of information about shipping arrangements, port arrangements, transport arrangement, both internationally and domestically. So it's simple in one sense, but the details of it and to get it right requires data and professional people who know what they're doing.
And the one thing that flows from that, I'm sure it probably is a yes and no. So in that global or even domestic supply chain, because you can have them domestically as well as globally, you would agree, certainly as a lawyer, that you have a lot of possible, you have a lot of legal arrangements being entered, a lot of possible conflicts. And getting back to where Natalie was, you again have to think progressively as to how you ring fence and manage to avoid or to best deal with inevitable disputes that could arise, right?
Absolutely. And the underpinnings of all of that to make it work is a risk appreciation and the allocation of risk, as Natalie had said.
Yeah, thanks, Ambassador. And Natalie, this one is for, well, I have two questions really that are geared to you in a sense, Natalie. The first being quite provocative, but I'm sure you will take it with your chin up. Where arbitration is inevitable, what is the best approach to ensure that you have the most independent panel? As I said, that's an interesting one for you.
I also have the Q&A panel up, and I see that the person who asked that question kind of built out and said, in other words, what mechanism can be built into your contract to ensure an objective and independent decision based on facts?
Yeah.
I hope that Natalie will forgive me if I say that it sounds like you may have had a bad past experience with an arbitral tribunal. I think I would suggest two things. The first is to think absolutely as you suggest as a matter of the arbitration agreement, picking an arbitral institution, for example, to the extent that you think you may be relying on the roster of arbitrators that is being proposed by that institution, picking one that is known to have a roster of experienced arbitrators who have a reputation and a track record for, in fact, kind of resolving the dispute fairly and on the basis of the evidence before them, will be a good step. To the extent that you want to give yourself belts and suspenders, or sort of belts and braces, you could include. This is one of the rare instances in which there are a couple of instances of kind of magic language. So you'd want to include, in terms of the governing law clause, that sort of the arbitrator shall decide the dispute pursuant to the rules, again, the law of filling that jurisdiction, and not, and then there's a Latin phrase that's used that basically says they're not going to decide it in a Solomonic fashion. They will actually apply the law to your dispute. But, so that's one. Yes, there are things that you can put in the contract, but by far, and again, I said, I cannot emphasize this enough, the biggest decision and step that you can take in order to ensure that you have a good panel is to pay attention to the people who are selected. Now, typically, you will have no say over the arbitrator that is suggested by the other side. You will be able to identify and propose your own arbitrator, if not appoint them directly. Therefore, where the critical point of leverage is in the identification and the selection of the chair. So you would want to, you can write this into the contract. You can speak to your own, the arbitrator that you have identified, and say, you know, so when you're going forward and selecting the chair, we want to have a say in it. You know, sort of that arbitrator shall consult with the party that has nominated or appointed them, so that you have a sense, and this doesn't come as a surprise to you. And then finally, yes, I should qualify what I said just a second ago. You can't decide, you know, kind of who the other side picks as their arbitrator. But if you know that there is an objective basis to doubt the impartiality and independence of that arbitrator, ideally, again, you will have picked one of the wild set of standard arbitration rules that give you the right to challenge that arbitrator's appointment. That is not something that you should take lightly, of course, but it is an important procedural protection that parties should consider when they are looking at the ultimate composition of the arbitral panel.
Okay, thanks, Natalie. And there's one other question that I have for you. It's really for you as well, Natalie. And I recognize this coming from one of my own students. And the question is, what are the best steps to becoming an international arbitration practitioner? And it follows as you're seeing in the panel there. And it's just guidance for a young emerging student who clearly has been impressed by what you've had to say, among others on this panel, and would want to know what steps could be taken to getting her to a level like yours.
So first of all, Ashley, I am delighted to see your interest in the field. One of the best developments, I think, in the world of international arbitration, or international disputes more generally, is that it is becoming a wider and more open and more inclusive group. So a key to that, of course, is continuing interest in joining the group. That doesn't mean that it is easy to join it. It is still, unfortunately, somewhat tricky. So number one, if for you, if there's anybody else who is still in school, still at university, still in law school, start laying that academic basis for it. International arbitration practice is its own field. It has a body of law. It has a set of principles. It has a pedagogy that is important to understand. Second, take advantage of the resources that are available to you. The fact that there is a JAIAC is a very important component and both a source of information and a connection to the rest of the world. One of the things that we have seen, perhaps more than any other factor that distinguishes the jurisdictions like Jamaica, the British Virgin Islands, Mauritius, etc., that in recent years have really devoted a lot of time and attention to making their mark on the world stage when it comes to international arbitration, is that connection to the rest of the world and the connection to the international arbitration community. So it may sound a little cheesy, but events like this, where you can meet and see and sort of imbibe the international arbitration world are important. In terms of sites where you can intern, their question does become a little bit trickier. What I would encourage you to do is to consider whether you are more interested in international dispute resolution or arbitration more generally, just as one of a set of tools that you want to develop as a lawyer. That will make you a better rounded practitioner, because that will take you in one direction, or whether you want to become a specialist in the area, which would potentially take you in a different direction. So what I would encourage you to do, since Dr. Malcolm said that you're one of his students, I will put Chris back in the firing line, reach out to him, and I would be happy to be called on to be a resource to help you identify possible places for internships.
Okay, thank you. Now, I must apologize for David, who had to leave to teach a class. He's in Panama, there to do some teaching, actually, in the area. But Ambassador, I think there's a question there, and it's a broader question to you, Ambassador, given your government involvement. What can we do, the broad question, I'm just paraphrasing it a bit, to ensure that our resources at government level are sufficiently well-tuned to deal with dispute management, given the centrality that we have said it has in commercial transactions and other transactions that we have to get into for development purposes? What can we do to improve upon the capacities that we have and to centralize dispute management in the overarching structure of government and governance?
Well, that's a broad question, because there, as Natalie has indicated and yourself, the choice of arbitration is really down to the private actors. The government's role is to make sure that there is a framework. And I believe that the governments, and here I'm talking broadly governments, I'm not talking about any party. I think the amendments we have put in place, fairly recent legislation that aids the sector and joining certain international bodies that allows for a JAIC to really exist and to prosper, possibly. And so the framework, the role for government is to really ensure that the framework exists, that it works closely with the institutions that are involved in the arbitration arena, and to make sure that they have the most up-to-date laws and regulation in place. In the general area, the insistence on putting in place, for example, a commercial court, I think, has assisted broadly the accessibility of dispute settlement mechanism. I think there's general agreement that the court has worked reasonably well over time. The addition of arbitration and mediation are other levels that have been introduced to assist in the dispute resolution area. And so the government's role primarily, as I see it, and from a policy point of view, is to make sure that it's up to date with the different international organization that regulates the area, and to ensure that the practitioners and those like Natalie and yourself and others who are steeped in it have the tools and the platform and the forum in which to carry out that work.
Thank you, Ambassador. I suppose the broader question, though, included, Ambassador, if I may, whether or not, outside of putting in legislative frameworks and so on, whether in the context of, and the question specifically asked about foreign affairs, and I suppose you could extend it to attorneys general chambers and so on, whether or not there is a space for improving upon the capacities, because I suspect that behind that question was an understanding that government lawyers and technocrats are very involved, certainly at the negotiation and other stages. And as Natalie mentioned earlier, in the context of Jamaica, gone by the man and really can't come with an evening very often. So we have to ensure that from the outset, you understand, and as Natalie also mentioned, and I think it is important, you have to have a clear understanding at the outset of the nature of the transaction, which side of the fence you're likely to end up on, claimant, respondent, and so on, in the event of a possible dispute and so on. And if you don't have that critical understanding at the outset, you could have problems. And if I were to just make one further comment before you intervene, I know, for example, in our region, I can think, for example, of a Costa Rica that has spent significant resources in terms of upskilling their own human resources and so on. And I think they've done pretty well in terms of getting themselves to a point where they can manage themselves. And it's a small jurisdiction, and that's why I chose it in the international arena. Are there things that we can be doing or should be doing to enable that to happen for us?
Okay. That dimension of the question, I'm sorry, I didn't get that dimension very clearly, but yes, that is an important part of it. The training and the exposures that we allow our civil servants and various government persons to access And they do have exposure. They do have the opportunity to go to training. There are a number of opportunities offered by international institutions for training. How they're taking advantage of, and whether they're sufficiently taken advantage of is a question that has to be considered continually. But upskilling and training opportunities are important. Whether, as I said, whether they are the right person going to the right trainings at the right times, I think that's a question that is too broad for me to answer. But when I served in the areas and at the times that I served as minister, that was an important part of what I would insist on, that persons get exposure and be trained. And in dispute resolution is one of the lawyering and the expertise in that area is important. But I think the ministry, at the ministry level, it's largely about the negotiating rules. And as Natalie said, it's important that you have in mind from then the possible disputes that can arise and how those can be resolved. I'll just point out though that many of the arrangements that governments are involved in, many of them are with the multilateral institutions. The choice of dispute resolution are not as flexible. Usually, the lending institution really has a lot of sway in what the organization, what the dispute settlement mechanism is. It's one of the things that I didn't hear Natalie address, and perhaps she can, and that is many times when you go into these negotiations, you have to take into consideration the power relationships, because that sometimes determine the flexibilities and degree of flexibilities you have for negotiation. And by that I mean sometimes the ability to simply walk away, because that's what in an ideal situation that exists when you have two parties equally yoked, if you will, and one can walk away from the negotiation as they like, if the negotiation is not securing or advancing their interests. In the multinational space, it usually is a lot more difficult. Ultimately, the government can get up and walk away. But sometimes in the bilateral arrangement, that is not as simple. Although I'm not saying that there's not room for tough negotiation. I'm simply saying that the scope is probably more limited sometimes.
Natalie, and there's something, Natalie, coming up, and there is a perception, as we probably know, that, where you have investor-state arbitrations, that small emerging economies are always on the beating end of the stick, or the being beaten end of the stick. Is there any truth to that? And if so, are there any safeguards that small emerging states could adopt to make themselves do better, one? And secondly, what about the transparency processes? How are those to be managed?
So that actually puts three things on my...
Sorry about that.
Don't worry. So I will start with Ambassador Hilton's question, the point that he made, which I think is an excellent one. And then I will go to the investor-state potential conundrum. Ambassador Hilton, absolutely correct to identify leverage and either the presence or the absence of leverage as a critical element about what happens in any negotiation. And you're right as well, Ambassador Hilton, that in some respects, sort of one of the things that underscores or illustrates a balance or imbalance of leverage is the ability of a party to walk away. But as a practical matter, walking away from the table is really the nuclear option, right? Sort of, if you got to the negotiation table in the first place, there was something, a common goal that the parties were working towards. And one of the benefits of having experienced players at the table, and you're absolutely correct, when one of the negotiating parties is a government, those experienced players have to include civil servants, who ideally will be long-serving civil servants, so that you will have some institutional memory and experience. And what sort of that experience identifies is there are a lot of things that you can do short of walking away from the table. You know, walking away should really be reserved for the nuclear options, the deal breakers. And one of the things that, again, if I have to think about what clients, both commercial entities and governments, sometimes fail to appreciate is when even the party with superior bargaining power says, this is the arbitration clause, and either implicitly or explicitly says, take it or leave it, that is rarely the end of the discussion. And it is helpful to have somebody either at the table or on your team who can say, you know what, the clause that they're putting to you now is not standard, it's not market. Or perhaps it may be kind of part of a model that this particular financial institution has used a lot in the time, but they have been willing to deviate from it in the following circumstances. And therefore you can explain to them, why are you treating me any different from fill in the blank of that country there? Or if you can't say, hey, I am aware of your own practice, and therefore I can talk to you about that, what you can do, again, from the benefit of experience, is to push past the position and to say, look, when you propose an arbitration clause that has this rule, this institution, this seat, clearly what you are looking for is the following set of criteria. But in forcing me to arbitrate 4,000 miles away from home, what you are basically doing is disincentivizing me from ever asserting a claim, even if it is meritorious. That's not fair. Let's see if we can find a compromise where we can, for example, put it in a seat, have a venue that you are comfortable with from a rule of law perspective, but that is actually a viable venue and seat for me, so that we actually, we give real content to the idea that there's an arbitration clause. Those kinds of discussions happen all the time. And this is where it's useful to have experienced people at the table who can be like, come on, be serious. Now let's really talk about what we're talking about. That was kind of number one. Number two, when we get to investor-state arbitration, for those who may not be as familiar, a lot of what we've been talking about is contracts, agreements, transactions, and deals that are sort of memorialized in written agreements, which may or may not include arbitration agreements. Investor-state dispute settlement, or ISDS, typically occurs under a treaty, where, for example, sort of the United States and Grenada have a bilateral investment treaty, which imposes on both governments, nominally, but typically the capital importing state, certain obligations with regard to the treatment of foreign investors, and gives the foreign investors standing and a right to assert claims in the event that the host state has breached those obligations. As Chris mentioned, there have been a lot of criticisms, waves of criticisms, actually, generations of criticisms of this system, both the treaties themselves and the provisions that they contain, and the way that disputes roll out. Coming to the specific question, is it one where small island states, for example, will always be on the losing end? The short answer is no. Barbados, for example, has a very good record of getting cases dismissed at an early stage. Grenada has won more cases than it has lost. Jamaica has, in fact, not been the subject of public investment treaty cases since the 1970s and 1980s. There have been some, I understand, not public matters that could probably be classified as investment disputes. But yes, of course, when you have disputes, the risk that a party will lose and that party will be a government, of course, remains. And if there is an imbalance of resources, of sophistication, of kind of the experience and quality of the team, then the chances that there may be an imbalance in that outcome increase. So what can a state do in order to improve its position? Number one, of course, take a look at the treaties that you are a party to. Understand what those treaties are. That is, at a sense, the baseline of your exposure. get a sense of what your past experience has been in terms of disputes that have or have not arisen under those treaties. And to the extent that you can, and this may be difficult to discern, figure out whether the treaties have actually garnered you more investment than the risk that they created. This is, again, a very clear-eyed assessment that Brazil, for example, has taken and has determined that it does not need to enter into any bilateral investment treaties. So it is a prime example of a major, major market in the Latin American and Caribbean sphere that doesn't have bilateral investment treaties. And then from the, you know, in some respects, once a dispute starts, you're still in the same position. Do you have the right team? Have you maximized your position with regard to picking the arbitrators? Have you identified and maximized any sources of potential leverage? And have you used them? So hopefully I've covered all three questions.
Yes, you have. Yes, you have. And it is important, and I'm happy you mentioned it, because there is this perception, which is not always rooted in reality, but it's there nevertheless. And I think we have to bear it in mind and ensure we deal with those issues. But all good things do come to an end. And much as we could have this conversation going on forever, literally, we are mindful of time and mindful that we have been at this for quite a little while now. And what I wish to do is to now thank the presenters as part of this reasoning that we have had. You made it very easy for me. And I must say I've learned a lot, and I thank you clearly on behalf of the audience, both here and those who will subsequently watch what has been presented, for the clarity with which you addressed the issue and the learning that you were able to impart to us in the manner in which you did, not being heavy and being something relatable. And I'm very happy for that. Now, at this point, without more, I wish to invite back Ms. Vera, who will give us a vote of thanks. And just by way of quick introduction, Ms. Vera is, as she said earlier, you speak about MSMEs, that is Ms. Vera for you. You speak about somebody who is at the heart and soul of development, particularly as it impacts assisting new industries to thrive and grow and develop. She is at the core of it. She is the Chief Executive Officer of the Jamaica Business Development Corporation, and she has extensive experience in all things having to do with management, particularly, as I said, relating to the small, medium, and micro enterprises. Ms. Vera, could we have you for your vote of thanks, please?
Yes, Christopher, Dr. Malcolm, and I'm glad you did reveal that I'm the chief troublemaker as well. Oh no, I must endorse what you just said, because let me tell you, knowledge enhancement maximum, respect due, as we say in Jamaica. And I really feel that we have had a rich presentation from all the presenters. So definitely we have learned a lot, and a lot to chew on and to follow up on. And in fact, all the things Natalie spoke of at the corporate level and government level, my MSMEs are right there. They need to get some of those skills enhanced as well as they try to build their own capacity. And they're in the international market, and they need to understand fully how to prevent disputes and prepare themselves for the great success that we know is possible. But I have 4 minutes, so I have to go wrap it up. And I really want to start by congratulating your team, Dr. Malcolm, and I'm going to name them, because let me tell you, if anybody could forget that this was not going to be on this evening and how we should prepare, it would not be the fault of your team. And I want to also confirm that I do have my cup of coffee right here beside me, and I think they did a marvelous job. And I'm speaking about Nordia Henry, Marlon Griffiths, Akeem Wilson, Tamika Campbell, and Denise Erkin Jones. Dr. Malcolm, you can be 100% proud of the kind of preparation that they supported your work with. Our local, regional, and international supporting institutions, which would have been the World Bank, CDB, JSE, Ambassador Hilton, Ms. Natalie Reid, and all our presenters, they were just wonderful. And we need to thank them for all the support they have been giving you, and particularly this evening. For me at JBDC, we know how sponsorship is critical for all the work we do. And I don't want to forget any of those who have supported this afternoon. So we have Jamaica Standard Products, Caribbean Development Bank, ADEB Consultants, CP Malcolm Dispute Management Practitioner, Island Blue Jamaica Mountain Coffee, Jamaica Deposit Insurance Corporation, and we saw their video, COK Solidarity Corporation Credit Union, and Roots Warrior. Now, the media is always critical as well, and the media partner on this one was Hype TV. Thank you so much for that kind of support. I want to thank Warrior King in advance, because I know we're going to have a vibes session right after this. So big thanks in advance, Warrior King, for what you're going to be sharing with us. And in all of this, I want to also say that the next webinar, and we know we can't miss any of these, is on the 23rd of June, 2021. Am I correct, Dr. Malcolm, that we have that coming up soon?
You are correct.
Yes, and we're looking forward to that. And I really want to say that this was a wonderful experience, and I want to thank everybody who tuned in, including the participants, because when we don't have participants, you know, we really don't feel that we have achieved. So we want to thank everybody that participated this afternoon. And I think that we are looking forward very anxiously for our next webinar, which, as I say, will be on June the 23rd. And of course, more information. If you can depend on our team, we will be getting more information. I know Dr. Smith has left us, and definitely my good friend, Mrs. Marlene Street Forest, as usual, was on the team with us. So thanks to everybody on behalf of JAIAC, and please keep on supporting Dr. Malcolm and his team, because they are making an important contribution to development, not only of the large companies, but for my favorite group, the MSMEs. So thank you very much to everybody. And I think we will now look forward to some great entertainment from Warrior King, and to finish drinking the coffee that your team shared with all of us. So thank you, and that's from me.
Thanks again all for having been with us and for having shared in this event. We wish to see you soon, and I'm sure the conversations will continue. There's certainly a lot that we need to look at, particularly at this time, and particularly as we seek as well to enhance our economies and to have them become more sustainable as we develop for the benefit of all. Have a good evening and enjoy the rest of this lockdown period that we're in for some persons, but certainly stay safe and keep healthy, whatever needs to be done, and follow the protocols as they are. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Local, regional, and international supporting institutions. Sponsors: Caribbean Development Bank, ADEB Consultants, Jamaica Standard Products, CP Malcolm Dispute Management Practitioner, Island Blue Jamaica Mountain Coffee, Jamaica Deposit Insurance Cooperation, COK Sodality Cooperative Credit Union, and Roots Warrior Productions. Media partner Hype TV.